Welcome to this, our third week of Summer Forum. I'm excited to bring some folks here that I've known and some who are new to me, so I'm really going to be interested in what takes place today. We're going to begin with some music, and before Victoria sings, I would like to say a couple of things about Victoria. One is, I have learned more from her courageous, forthcoming expressions of what I have grown up with that I didn't know was my privilege until I heard how my privilege oppressed and even persecuted others I was dimly aware of. So, Victoria, I can't thank you enough for entering my life and awakening me, awakening my conscience. I don't think I will ever go back to who I was. The other thing I want to say about Victoria is just recently she was accepted at the Star King School for the Ministry, the Unitarian Seminary in Berkeley. So congratulations. Victoria may turn out to be the Unitarians' first minister who sings opera and leads demonstrations all on the same day. So Victoria, let's hear from you the famous national anthem from James Weldon Johnson.
Sing a song full of faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of hope that the present has brought us. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring. Ring with the harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing raise as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling sea. Facing a rising sun of a new day begun, let us march on till we have victory.
Those of you who are members of this congregation several weeks ago received the 2016 annual report, and in it is a report about the startup of this congregation's anti-racism committee. I was a part of a book study group back in February of 2015 where we read together a book called Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race by Debbie Irving. And her story so closely paralleled mine in terms of waking up to ways of living that I assumed everybody lived and it was perfectly all right because my intentions were pure. So at the end of this study group, a number of us thought, this cannot end here. We need to develop, as a part of the environmental ministry and the Social Justice Council, an anti-racism component. So a number of us met for several months, developed a charter, it was approved, and now there is such a thing as the Anti-Racism Committee. And you'll see out front a banner. It says Black Lives Matter, and it also says standing, help me, on the side of love, because there are a growing number of congregations that in the Unitarian Fellowship that are becoming active in Black Lives Matter movement. And so the church has even developed a special banner that ties the two together. Over the time since the Anti-Racism Committee was started, the committee has hosted 14 events here in the church. They've co-sponsored with the Environmental Ministry and the Social Justice Council another 23 events and have participated in 6 public rallies. So if you add that up, that's 43 events. And I guess we consider welcoming the Showing Up for Racial Justice group today as our 45th supported public event. Some of you may remember that when Matthew Cochran read his annual report, he left the congregation with a challenge of 3 questions that he encouraged us to ask as we're preparing for what next after our 125th anniversary. And here are the 3 questions. Who do you want to welcome? What do you want to welcome them into? And how? How are you willing to be changed by their presence and participation? So as you reflect on your own personal views of where we go from here, let's welcome Kate and Easton to this podium to hear more about showing up for racial justice.
Thank you, Harold. Thank you so much for having us here. I'm Kate.
I'm Easton.
We're with Showing Up for Racial Justice, and we're so honored to be here. We've never had such a towering podium from which to speak. So this is exciting.
So Showing Up for Racial Justice, also called SURJ, is an organization that was founded about 6 years ago. But it didn't really take off until about 2013 when the Black Lives Matter movement started in this country. The national media spotlight and the center point of politics in this country, everybody was looking at the Black Lives Matter movement, and it was centering voices of people of color. It was centering Black lives. It was centering the organizations that were led by Black people in the Black community. Many white people were on the sidelines wondering, how can I be a part of this? And there wasn't always an easy in. SURJ was a ready-made container for white people to join up and be a part of this movement. SURJ, the whole philosophy is to have white people, or not necessarily white people, have anybody go in but organize the white community explicitly to show up for racial justice. So rather than having white people go into communities that are not their own and try to speak to other people's experience of racism in this country, the idea is for white people to help organize their own folks, to educate, to show up, to be in solidarity. SURJ has allied with many different organizations led by people of color. working on all kinds of things like educational events, door-knocking campaigns, and direct actions, such as disrupting Donald Trump's speeches.
Oh, a smattering of applause.
Always a fun thing to do. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to recognize the UU for the work that they've already done. Reverend Harold spoke a little bit about this, but I think it's important to recognize the way that the Unitarian Church has been at the forefront of faith-based racial justice organizing for a very long time. The Anti-Racism Committee of this church is very encouraging, but also nationally. I recently read about the General Conference, which I believe was last week or last month. There was a resolution of the reaffirmation to the commitment for racial justice. That was, I think, a document that was put together by a bunch of young people to really call on the church to talk less and act more around racial justice. And I think this sort of internal critique within the church to be discussing what it really means to be a faith-based racial justice organization, I think is really important, and it's very encouraging to see.
Yeah, so you obviously don't need us to come here and tell you racism is a problem here in Utah. You've already done a lot of work to figure that out. You know the statistics. So Black people in Utah make up 1% of our population and a whole 6% of our prison population. Latinos make up 13% of our general population and a quarter of our prison population. And you've, I'm sure, already shared concern about stories that we're constantly hearing of people who are threatened and harassed by others here because of their race. People who are targeted by police and who are denied service at businesses. You know all of this already. In a lot of ways, Utah is much like the rest of the country, but we have our own peculiar history here. We begin each SURJ meeting with little snippets of Utah history, the history of race in Utah, to educate ourselves. But for me, this has been very personal. I'm a fifth-generation Utahn from Mormon settler stock, and so I do my genealogy as any good Mormon kid would, and I inadvertently stumbled across some of this extreme brutality in our history. I'm going to share just 2 pieces of that, and I apologize if these are troubling things to hear. I understand if people would not like to hear this on a Sunday morning, but I think it's important also to bring this into this space, just to remember who we are here and what our history is. One is, so I grew up hearing at home and in church and in school that the white people who settled here were kinder than other sorts of white people. You know, we were led by God's will rather than just a resource land grab. And then, so you already know the end of the story, right? But then I learned about the Bear River Massacre. I learned about the Pipe Springs Massacre. I learned about the murders of indigenous people that happened in association with the Black Hawk War. Recently, I grew up in St. George, Utah, on the Virgin River, beautiful river that I love. And I learned only this year, at 32 years old, did I learn that the people my ancestors went down there to convert, the Tonnequint Paiute, within 20 years were completely wiped out by my ancestors. And it took me this long to learn that. Brigham Young boasted in a sermon, speaking of indigenous people here in Utah, how many were here when we came? At the Warm Springs, at this little grove where they would pitch their tents, we found perhaps 300 Indians, but I do not suppose that there are 3 of that band left alive now. There was another band a little south, another north, another further east, but I do not suppose there is 1 in 10, perhaps not 1 in 100 now alive of those who were here when we came. Second part is I didn't hear in Utah history pageants that Black slaves were bought and sold here in Utah until 1862. I didn't hear about the laws my ancestors passed against interracial marriage, as well as city ordinances that barred African Americans from swimming in municipal pools or eating in restaurants or staying in hotels. And I didn't know about the racist business policies and real estate policies. And so doing some of this history work, there's at least 12 known lynchings that happened in this state. The second story I wish to share is that it's about the murder of a black miner named Robert Marshall in 1925 in Price, Utah, which is about 2 hours away. He was accused of killing a mining company agent, and so he was arrested, taken to the courthouse, but a crowd was there, and they took him and drove 3 miles out of the city along with a convoy of about 100 vehicles. He was hung from a cottonwood tree for about 10 minutes, cut down, found to still be alive, and so he was hung again until he was killed. The Price newspaper afterwards, the Price Sun, wrote, quote, "Your neighbors, or the mob consisted of your neighbors, your friends, the tradespeople with whom you are wont to barter day by day, public employees, folks prominent in church and social circles. No attempt at concealment was made by any member of the lynching party. There was quite a sprinkling of women, the wives and mothers of the good folks of the town, and too, there were even some children. No one was ever convicted of this murder." These traumas and so many more of them happened here in this state, but none of them showed up in my Utah history classes. And we also didn't hear our state stories of the incredible resistance by people of color in this state, nor did we hear about interracial solidarity for racial justice that's happened in the state. Instead, I grew up hearing explicitly racist narratives about our history and our current social problems. And I'm not the only one, and I'm not the end of it either. There are children right now hearing these stories, receiving social and political education that promotes a white supremacist agenda.
So it's obviously horrifying to hear about these instances of racial injustice in the history of the state. And it's important to know these things so that we understand our history. But it's not just our history. There's, the violence is not over. There's a major, major resurgence of right-wing white militias in this country right now. And these militia movements are fueled by an economic downturn, by the election of Obama, and by movements like the Black Lives Matter movement. They are a backlash against racial progress in this country. A couple of us actually went to a rally held at the Utah State Capitol a few months ago that was held by members of the Bundy family, by other militia groups. This was right after the Malheur Wildlife Refuge occupation in Oregon. And while these groups are not explicitly or directly white supremacist, their rhetoric is white supremacist. They talk a lot about reclaiming America. And we have to ask, what do they want to reclaim? What is it that they want to take back America from? And I think it's that they want to reinstall the legal mechanisms of racial oppression in this country, like Jim Crow. They want to knock down things like affirmative action and other ways of racial progress in this country. They want to reaffirm the privileges that white men used to have back in the 1950s. That's the America they want again. They want a continuation of a culture and a politics of colonization. They don't want to recognize this history that we just talked about, and they certainly don't want to recognize that that we live in a multicultural society. So it's no surprise that within this moment, within this context, Donald Trump is incredibly popular. He's catalyzed by the same forces as these militias, by people who are sexist, xenophobic, and hate-filled. He is supported, and he really capitalizes off of people's fears of economic loss, of loss of their social privilege. Neither Trump nor the militias should be taken lightly. And the standard liberal response of laughing at people for being uneducated, of alienating people who don't agree with you, is not going to cut it right now. It's just going to further marginalize the people we need to bring in. The people who are supporting Donald Trump, while, yes, a lot of their views and a lot of their rhetoric is reprehensible, a lot of their actions are racist, just calling them stupid is not going to do anything to help us. And it's going to discount the grievances that are legitimate that they may have, like not being able to have a job anymore, like being genuinely afraid of change, which is something that I think a lot of us can feel at various times. So rather than doing this, rather than laughing at people, we need to engage, and we need to engage with compassion, and we need to do the hard work of bringing people in. And I'm speaking especially to the white community at this moment. We need to call our fellow white people in, and we need to have the hard conversations, even if it's not fun.
Because at the same time we're seeing the rise of fascism in the United States, we are witnessing an incredible movement for racial justice. So we've seen it with the Black Lives Matter movement, and we're seeing it with the Dreamers and other immigrant rights movements. We're witnessing we're witnessing history to see people of color more and more leading these movements, to mobilize people, to organize and educate, to take direct action in really brave and exciting ways to fight racism and fascism here in the United States. So the question is, with all of this going on, what role do we have as white people? Where do we fit in? How do we take part of this movement? Because it involves as well, while we're going through it, dealing with our own racist legacies, our own feelings of white guilt, perhaps. And so how do we do work in a way that actually supports the movements that are happening, that are being led by people of color, rather than detract or lead them in different directions? So as SURJ nationally, we've taken sort of 6 lessons that we've learned from past movements to guide how we do this work. And so it's kind of our 6 core principles that I think are useful whether you're part of SURJ or not, in terms of how you should do work.
The first one is calling people in, not calling people out. So we agree that there are times to shame and blame people, but we're also committed to engaging with love and with patience to call other people into this work. I think a lot of people, white people especially, are paralyzed by the fear that everything they say will somehow be wrong, and that they will be aggressively confronted and policed by others when they're trying to have a conversation about race or racial justice. We're trying to fight against this culture of calling out by calling people in, by being clear and direct about what we feel, not necessarily withholding our punches, but engaging people with the intention to bring them closer rather than to push them away.
The second, number 2, is take risks, make mistakes, learn, and keep going. This wonderful line from Black Lives Matter organizer Maurice Mitchell is, "Your individual anxiety about possibly getting things wrong has nothing to do with my liberation." So we're going to have to take risks. People of color take risks every day just by living their lives with full human dignity, and so we're going to have to take some risks as well. That means that as we're doing this work, we're going to make mistakes, but our commitment is to learn and to keep showing up again and again.
The third principle is to tap into mutual interests. While we recognize that our own liberation and humanity as white people is inextricably linked to racial justice, what we're doing is different from just helping ourselves, but it's also not just helping others. This is about tapping into ways that we are bound together in our need for a just and livable future.
The fourth is accountability through collective action. I'm sure you all know folks who are predominantly concerned with being right. They want the right analysis and the right talking points and the right friends, but while we're worried about being correct, Black people are being murdered, immigrants are being deported, Indigenous people are being further dispossessed. And so the idea is real accountability means taking action, not being so concerned about whether you're always right or not. So the second part of that is, while we organize white people to take action, we maintain relationships of accountability with groups and individuals who are people of color, who are leaders of the racial justice movement, in order to maintain accountability to them as well.
The fifth one is enough for everyone. While a white European culture teaches us to feel isolation and scarcity and to believe that we need to compete with each other to survive, SURJ maintains that there is enough for all of us, but that it's unequal distribution which keeps resources scarce. We believe that part of our role as white people is to raise resources to support efforts led by people of color and to engage more with white people in racial justice.
The sixth and final principle is that growing is good. We can be afraid that if we bring people in without vetting them properly, that maybe they're gonna say the wrong thing or do something that makes us uncomfortable. But we're worried that that's gonna mess us up. But there are two things. One is we have to grow this movement, and we can't do that if we have a lot of fear about who's going to join with us in it. And the second part is, what makes us think we're so special that we're the right white people who can do the work? So we're all messing up all the time. We're going to keep messing up. We're going to keep learning and keep going. And so our goal is always to be welcoming people in, even at the risk that that will sometimes be messy and there will sometimes be conflict. But that's sort of deeply part of what our work here is to do.
So we have some concrete asks for all of you today. We want you to be willing to have hard conversations with your family, with your friends, and with strangers, even if that's really difficult. We want you to support organizations and actions that are led by people of color. This movement, and while we're honored to be a part of it, and we think it's really important to be organizing with white people and to be organizing the white community, the racial justice movement in this country will always be led by people of color. And we need to take their leadership and we need to support them. Even if you aren't 100% on board with their tactics, even if you find their messaging to be a little bit harsh or to be a little bit off from what you want, please recognize their leadership and offer your support. And if you want to have conversations about the nuances or ways that you critique that, those are conversations that can be had, but maybe before you make some sort of public denunciation, really think about what you're doing and how you might be discouraging a movement that's really important. Also, we have some lawn signs out of the table out there, and these lawn signs say Black Lives Matter on them. One of SURJ's national campaigns has been to put up these lawn signs in people's yards. We actually, last month, went and did a door-knocking campaign over by Liberty Park, and we engaged with people on their doorsteps, talking about racial justice and asking them to put up these signs. They're really good conversation starters. If you want to pick one up from us, they can get you talking with your neighbors about racial justice, and they also show publicly that you support a movement in this country. And all of the proceeds, we buy them directly from the supplier, and all the proceeds go to the Black Lives Matter movement. Finally, please join us. We've got a sign-up sheet out there for our email. SURJ is a great group. We really want to grow. There's also other groups in Salt Lake City doing this work. There's a coalition called Racially Just Utah that is a bunch of different racial justice organizations coming together. You should check out Racially Just Utah as well. We'd really love to have you.
And it feels strange to be up here speaking at you, because I'm certain all of you have your own experiences and own stories and ideas of how this work can be done. These are our experiences, and we would love to have you help us figure out together where we should be going and what our next steps would be. So thank you so much.
We'll take a brief intermission, especially for those of you who are members of our congregation and who have pledged contributions. So we will now take an offering before we continue with the rest of the program. We will be hearing and also perhaps being led by Lauren Wood in a hymn that's one of my favorites because of its challenging message. I've had sermons back when I was a congregational minister just focusing on the words of Amazing Grace, and particularly the author of those words, John Newton, who was for many years a slave ship captain. And as is often the case, in order to get his conscience changed, he had to nearly lose his life in a shipwreck. And as he was clinging for dear life, he promised God that he would change. About 10 years later, he did change. And he eventually became a minister and the author of these words. Lauren, it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you for giving the context to this song. I think that that story of John Newton is maybe appropriate for many of us who feel like we may have made mistakes in the past and continue to make mistakes. Maybe not as big of mistakes as being the captain of a slave ship, but it felt like an appropriate song to bring to you today. So if you want, on page 205 of the hymnal book, there are the lyrics to Amazing Grace. I will ask that if you want to sing, please do, and please come in the second verse. I'll do the first verse for you to get us going, but please do feel free to sing along if you feel so inclined. Oh, incidentally, Victoria also has really amazing CDs out on our table for a small price, and please support her in her beautiful music as well. Thanks. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now am found. Was blind, but now I see. 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, we have already come. 'Twas grace that brought us safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. What we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the you.
Okay, I think we have a few minutes for comments or questions. Maybe the two of you can just, if that mic's still hot, you can stand there.
Right.
Hello. I'm one of all of us who has white privilege, and I can't even begin to know what it is. I was once in a YMCA workshop where we had an exercise where we saw a little bit of what it was. But could Victoria or someone else tell me directly to my face, where do I have white privilege that you see? I want to learn from you.
Okay, I'll give some basic examples of white privilege, starting right here from our own congregation, with experiences that happen right here, because then I think it makes more sense than trying to borrow from elsewhere. This is an example of an incident that happened, I would say maybe 2 singing seasons ago. We were singing the Requiem. I was in the choir. Everybody in the soprano line didn't move, right as I arrived. You know how people shift to make room for you? They didn't move. The lady who came in with me, who was an alto, in her section, people moved around so she could join in. The choir continued. I was sitting on the pew. I had rehearsed my section for months and months. It's not an easy piece of music, and it was responsorial. What I mean by that is when the soprano line sings something, the others respond from elsewhere. I talked to the leaders in the music, and I said, when am I joining my section? And one of the leaders said, no, you're stuck in the pew. I looked around, and nobody said anything in the choir. And the lady who had given me a ride said, let me talk to somebody so that they can move around and let you in. That cost me even more pain. And I said, why is it that somebody had to ask somebody to let me in? Isn't it just something that happens naturally, that when somebody wants to sit by you, you just happen to move naturally? Can anyone tell me why is it that it didn't seem like a natural response to have people move? The sense that it didn't feel odd that somebody was stuck where they were not supposed to be. These are what I call, these are really fine elements of white privilege. You don't see anything wrong even though somebody's excluded. That doesn't bother you. Another example of white privilege, as I've experienced it, is from my colleagues here in the presentation. I think it was item 3, if not 4. They said, this is not about calling people out or calling people in. This is about a conversation to bring people together. If you put lines of demarcation, it cannot be a conversation. What I mean by that, when you say it cannot be about people calling people out, let it be about calling people out. Let it be anything. Let people be comfortable. Because if you set boundaries, there are people who are going to be hurt because they are worried about, for example, I'm worried about, am I calling somebody out now because I'm talking about the choir? If you think I am, but I cannot be afraid to share my pain. I'll give another example. Another example was about a group here, Waking Up White. One of the church members here said it was decided that I couldn't participate because I'm black. And I said, yes, I'm black, but thanks for not inviting me, but I will be there. The most important aspect of this conversation was so we don't make enemies. None of these people are my enemies. We keep open dialogue, open communication. Another example involves a situation that I shared in one of the group meetings, and it involved one of the people in the meeting. And I said, I don't appreciate how when I go to a neighborhood or a community, people say, oh, you tell your neighbors, hey, we have black guests in our home. And I said, why do you have to tell your neighbors that you have a black family in your home? Why is this important? The individual was offended because they felt like I had called them out, and this was not happening here for the first time. It happened in other settings. So I guess why I'm bringing this is one Unitarian minister gave it an appropriate term. He called it white fragility. He said, he cannot be responsible for it. I don't want to hurt anybody. But it caused me so much pain to see this individual hurt by what I had said. And for months, I've been struggling with trying to isolate myself so that I wouldn't continue to do more hurt. But in the process, I stopped talking about these experiences. Well, I'll stop there.
I just want to add that that's an incredible privilege, like to be able to hear a person's personal experiences about microaggressions and aggressions that they've experienced, and just so thankful for that. Yeah.
Welcome to Boston, from Boston to Salt Lake City.
Thank you. Yes, thank you. My name is Reverend Gretchen Weiss. I serve our church in Attleboro, Massachusetts, and I'm here visiting friends in Salt Lake. And so, as part of an answer to your question, I will admit that I don't talk about white privilege when I preach about justice issues in my congregation, because I find the word privilege to be so loaded and to build more walls than bridges. So I talk instead about us being part of dominant culture. And for example, in dominant culture, no police officer has ever pulled me over wondering why I'm driving a new car. Does that make sense? I have never been followed in a department store with the assumption that I'm going to steal something. When I ask a question, I find that most store clerks treat me with courtesy and kindness. And yet I've witnessed firsthand them treating people of color right next to me or behind me with horribly. So I invite you into the concept of being part of a dominant culture. We're like fish that swim in the ocean and we don't know what water is because it's everywhere around us. Or for many women, I invite you to pay attention the next time that you're in a drugstore. Go through the cosmetic aisle, and every major brand of cosmetics has a color called nude. And guess what? It's going to look a lot better on my skin than it is going to look on our dear friend here who's going to seminary, and good luck to you in that journey. And yet the color's beige. But it's just these very, very small microaggressions, and some not so small, that dominant culture does to lift up that there's one right way of being in the world, and it doesn't include others. The other thing I wanted to say, thank you for the work you're doing, and to let people know that our denomination also has an organization called Allies for Racial Equity. We have annual conferences, and it is all about building partnerships, taking a look at dominant culture issues, and being good allies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a minute, I want to hear, do you have anything? Okay.
Just a thumbs up.
I don't have much to say, but I figure since there's only other black person here, I ought to say something. But our Reverend here said it best. And so just one example of what she says, I've often gone home and told my family I got stopped driving while black, and that's common.
I just want to make a brief comment about white privilege, because I think it's a very important term to use. I had one of my daughters is a school teacher, and much of her career has been teaching in multiracial kind of classes. And one day we were taking a walk together, and she said something to me about, Dad, your white privilege. And it made me really angry. I thought, what the hell are you talking about? Me privileged. I grew up in a poor home. I've worked hard all my life. I got my scholarships. I'm the one that paid the way, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And from that event, though, it began my journey. That's been a really important journey, and not long after that, I met Victoria in a meeting, and you have to start someplace. And I think what always has amazed me is how offended I was when I was called white privilege, and yet, of course I am. And anyway, so I think it's important that we allow people to have to struggle with that.
Yeah, I just want to make a little comment. I mean, I think there's a thread here of talking about, I think, Victoria mentioned the term white fragility. And I think that's that's a lot of what we're talking about here is the way in which it's really painful sometimes and really difficult for white people to understand their own privilege. And when they are called out, it can be almost like absurdly hard for white people to understand things. And that's why it's called white fragility, right? It's like a very fragile thing that when it's crossed, it's like push back and just push back and push back. And I think a lot of what SURJ started as a lot of people of color in the movement for racial justice saying, we're sick of educating white people about privilege and making them show up and organize them, because when we talk about these things, the backlash against us as people of color is so large, and we're sick of it. And so part of what SURJ, I think, tries to do is be a place where white people can talk about these issues in a way where hopefully the residual effects of people opening up and dealing with these things, which can sometimes be really hard, doesn't disproportionately fall on people of color. Other white people can do that work and kind of take the burden of that to a certain extent.
One thing that I found incredibly interesting when I was reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' book is that he says the problem is that you think of yourself as white, okay? People from all over the parts of the world that don't receive bright sunlight all think of themselves as white. And people who live where the sun is strong are dark-skinned because otherwise they'd be dead. And so if you're thinking of yourself as white, that's white privilege.
I just want to relate a simple example of this white privilege. I'd like just to relate a simple example of this white privilege that I came across last week when I was at a speech by a vice presidential candidate for the Revolutionary Party. His name is Lamont Lilly, and he's black, and he does a lot of work with the Black Lives Matter movement. I think he's from California, I'm not sure, but he, in reading about him and researching him a little bit, I found out that, and he talked about this also in his speech at the U of U last week, being arrested as a young person and being charged with a felon, convicted, for giving his discount to a friend. And I thought, oh yeah, when I was working at J.C. Penney's and I was 21, I gave a discount to my friend. And I wasn't that worried. I was a little worried that I might get caught, but I can't imagine I would have been charged with a felon. And I can think of other examples in my life, and life isn't easy for any of us. So you think about your struggles, and it's not until like 5 years ago that I started realizing, we all have struggles, but those struggles are different, systemically different for black people than they are for white people.
Come on down to, if you don't mind, come down and take a little, because I can't climb very well.
Hi. This is my first time here, and I just want to say thank you for the warm welcome. I came specifically to hear what you guys are doing with SURJ. I did not know there was a chapter here in Salt Lake, and I'm so glad, so I'll get on your mailing list. But to address some of the questions, I've been looking at this. I mean, we live in a weird place anyway, but I've been looking at ways to show up and to speak up. And when I went, maybe some of you went to the Parliament of World Religions last fall, and there was a panel specifically on Black Lives Matter, and Jim Wallace and several of the people who marched in Ferguson were there. And when people asked, what can I do to learn more about white privilege and how I can stand up and show up, to a person, they all said, take the online course called Hard Conversations, Intro to Racism, with Patty Dye and Victor Lee Lewis, D-I-G-H. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a month-long course. The next one starts in October, and it's people all around the world. Oh, okay. It's people all around the world learning about this together and having hard conversations and learning how to do it. Have you guys done it? No? Do you know it? Yeah. Okay. So that's where I'm starting. They also have courses on Islamophobia, transgender phobia, that kind of thing. So it's a little bit of investment of time and money, and it's a worldwide conversation. Hard Conversations, Intro to Racism. Thanks for what you're doing, and boy, thanks for the welcome. Thank you.
I figured I might as well take this opportunity to say that you might have seen on your program that next week, 365 will be here. 365 is an organization I'm a co-sponsor of. And what we do, we represent loving yourself, expressing yourself, supporting one another 365 days a year. We're not a political organization. We're a mixture of all denominations, but a lot of the information that we share are based on racial injustices and racism and things like that. So some of it's a little harsh to hear, but it's real, and it's the conversation that we're talking about in the way of music and art. Thank you.
Benjamin and I have spent quite a lot of time preparing for this program that happens next week. And one of the things I've said is, please let your poets and your singers know, do not censor the words. Grown-ups will be here. Well, put them back in. Okay, it's about time for me to call a halt to the public part of this, but Kate and Easton will be here a little longer. But before we go, let's conclude with another beautiful song, and you can say whatever you want in terms of your introduction to that song.
I don't know if this is a song, but I wanted to take an opportunity to share a very profound moment in white privilege. It's very emotional. But this was concerning my immigration deportation. So many people from this community and other white communities showed up at the hearing. And some were wearing posters. Give Victoria her passport, all kinds of different things. And Judge Nixon said, I think we're going to have a fire hazard. And I said, you bet you're going to have a fire hazard. So I just wanted to share with you how important it is for you to show up. Even if you don't know why you're there, just go. It makes a difference. Because I still think that maybe I would have prevailed in my immigration hearing, but the white people in my community showing up really abridged a long conversation. So thank you so much for your support. I forgot I'm singing, sorry.
One last song, go ahead.
Okay, the first song was the Black National Anthem. Some people call it the Negro Anthem, and I thought I should give that brief introduction so that you kind of see how the two songs weave into our conversation today. And this second song is a South African national anthem, and I thought I wouldn't be singing liberation songs because now I am in America where we have freedom.